Alrighty, recording in progress. Let's go. Let's share screen. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for being there. Interesting session today. Lots of numbers to wrap your head around, but as I always say, it's something that you absolutely have to do. It's part of the preparation to registration. It's got nothing to do with registration, but just to make sure that the landholder actually understands exactly what they're in for to the dollar is important. So let's go. It's coming up. It's coming up. TikTok, TikTok. Here we go. Just wanted to start by the question that Wally asked yesterday about stratification. You remember those little pockets that you were asking questions about on why was it stratified differently than around the rest of it? So I zoomed into it, and that's the one on the northwest part of the CEA. It's nothing special, but you see that it's just before the head of an erosion gully. Therefore, I suspect that there would be some water drainage coming this way, and that area would probably be wetter than surrounding, and it's been detected by the wetness indexed. Similarly, there was the other one more on the eastern side that we detected as different, and you can clearly see, I think Mel said that there's obviously a little bit of water pooling happening here, and therefore the soil moisture would be different, which is interesting because it shows that, yeah, it's not completely accurate, but those remote sensing algorithms, yeah, are pretty good to detect those kind of things. Right. Okay, that was on the stratification. What are we going to talk about today? The key money flows of a project in and out, just to wrap your mind around what's important, where are the big masses. Then we'll talk about the abatement calculations per method, what goes into an offset report. Then we'll dive down, so that's more on the revenue side. On the cost side, we'll look in a bit more detail to admin costs, and then project cost as well. What's cash cost and what's time cost, because more often than not, the landowner actually does stuff on their own time. That still has a cost, so you need to account for it. Then we'll put it together. We'll look at the ACCU flows and cash flow of real projects to see how different they are depending on methods, and what you have to be careful of if you want to manage your cash flow if you're a self-proponent, or how using a third party like RFM you can actually have that cash flow smoothed for you. And then we'll pick up on a question that Vince asked yesterday about when I was saying that a soil carbon project as 100 hectare is risky, depending on the yield that you have. And Vince picked up on that and said that, if you estimate that sort of yield, well, then you should be making money. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, because that's actually a really, really, really good question to look at in detail and be able to make sure that you're not misleading your landholder in making, having a real estimate of what they're in for, including the risks. So we'll have a quick look at that. Right on. And as usual, Wally is keeping a close eye on the questions. Please interrupt at any time if you want. As usual. Right on. The key dollar flows. Now, those ones are really broad brush estimates, just to show you an order of magnitude of where the things are, what matters or not. In order of magnitude dollars more than anything else. They're roughly accurate, but every project will be slightly different, and therefore will be slightly different, right? So you got one column for what goes out, then what comes, what money comes in, and then the certainty that you can get at every stage. And vertically, you got the feasibility stage, where you're just assessing whether any project has a chance of running on a given property. Then the registration stage where you decided, yeah, I'm gonna do that that project. And then the project starts, project setup after declaration of your project. There are usually some costs associated with just setting up the project, and then the ongoing cost with when you started your project. And that's where your money comes in finally, with all the costs up front before you make any dollar from a carbon credit. By the way, I'm always assuming here that you sell your credits, but you don't necessarily sell your credits. You might keep some of them for your carbon neutrality, for example. But just to have an idea of value, we assume that you're actually selling them, but of course you don't have to. Right, feasibility. It usually costs you about, depending on the size of the property, the number of methods, and whether it's complicated or not. How many properties do you have? Just to have an idea, it would cost you, a couple of $1,000s to know whether you have a chance of running a project or not. Right, worth doing, because in some instances I've done estimates for proponents that, after half a day looking at it, which wasn't $2,000, you could see there was no method that was easily going to be run on that. Certain times it takes a little bit more time and discussion with the landholder. Are they prepared to sacrifice part of their property? Would they do this? Would they do that, etc., to define whether you have a chance of running a project. Registration, then you have a few more costs because it takes more time. For example, as Kim would know very well, or anybody who's come anywhere close to an audit clearing project, the eligibility is extremely hard to prove and long to find out. And sometimes you spend the time and you can't actually prove that the project is eligible because it's very difficult. It's a high bar to pass. So there you've got a few more costs coming in. For some methods, typically planting, EMP, and soil carbon, you also have to have external costs to certify your land management strategy for soil carbon, or an ecologist to prepare your planting definition for EMP. It doesn't strictly, as I said, it doesn't strictly have to be done at that time, because strictly speaking, you don't have to have your planting prepared. But there are, and the CER inevitably asks questions about, what will your seed mix be, right? Before declaration, whether you don't have to declare the project, you don't have to have your seed mix prepared, but they will ask those questions. They will ask about your planting geometry, etc., etc. And you also need to know that to be able to do your full carbon calculations and have an estimate of an amendment estimate for your project. So there are a few costs there. Soil carbon is probably the cheapest because it's quite easy to register, and the external costs are only the certification of the land management strategy, but it starts to add up a bit. Now, your project is declared, and now you've got to set it up. You always have a few costs in terms of setting up your monitoring system, modifying your procedures on farm, maybe fencing. You always have a few costs there. But the big one, of course, well, the obvious one is also the baseline sampling for soil carbon. But the big one is for planting, where you have to do the planting, right? And the cost for planting vary a lot depending on what sort of planting you do, your terrain, how sophisticated you want to be with your planting, whether if you use seeding or tube stock or etc., etc. Costs can vary between, I've seen $2,000, not a project I've worked on, but I've heard $2,000 per hectare, up to $7,000 per hectare, which is a project that I worked on, $7,000 per hectare to do the planting. But that was a very, very sophisticated, with a high conservation intent. So the species selected was rare species, which pushes the cost of the tube stock, etc. The terrain was not very easy, so you had to need for a lot of irrigation. It was an sugarcane farm, So there was a bit of soil remediation to do as well. So that was an expensive planting, but that's really an outlier. I usually work on between $2,000 and $3,000 per hectare for planting. I'm sure on the call there are people that are way more qualified than me to talk about ecology and cost of planting. Happy to have your input there. Now, ongoing project costs over the 25-year, and we're talking over the 25-year for that. The biggest ones is, of course, your audit. I usually work on 3 audits at $20,000. The initial audit is more expensive than the follow-up audits, yeah, on average, if you're lucky to have a cheap one and even cheaper ongoing, you might go down below that $60,000, but just to be on the conservative side, I usually use $60,000. And then after that, for soil carbon, of course, you have your regular soil sampling. Reporting also costs money. Oh, something, yes, I should have mentioned. In this, coming back to the cash cost versus time cost, I've assumed that you do everything is outsourced. The landholder doesn't do anything. But of course, I think any landholder is capable of doing an offset report, and certainly regular reporting, and certainly notification, and certainly a lot of the monitoring for some methods. For example, avoided clearing can be done directly by the landholder. So those costs can come down if the landholder is doing some of them, but it does not include some things like fencing, for example, which is too hard to predict. You're going to have to include that on a case-by-case basis. Fencing is necessary for plantings until at least the seedlings will be resistant to whatever livestock is grazing. So say year 5, unless you're grazing more aggressive animals. But at least for the beginning, you need to have your fencing. It's not necessary for soil carbon, obviously, and not necessary for avoided clearing. Grazing is completely permitted in avoiding clearing CEAs. So basically, you're looking at $90,000 for EMP, a little bit more expensive than avoided clearing, because you have some tree sampling to do. If you have a specific calibration, not if you have a generic calibration. Soil carbon is more expensive because of the requirement to do the soil sampling. Right. So those are the costs. You can see that it adds up, and it goes up when you're getting closer to the real thing, and you will spend, well, the landholder will spend all that money until finally, minimum 6 months in the case of avoided clearing, and minimum 5 years, or maybe 3 years in the case of planting. You submit an offset report and you get some ACCUs. Well, in the case of planting, you'll see the yield there in the last column that I've used to calculate the return, and at $30 an ACCU. So for a planting project over the 25 years, will get you $850,000, avoided clearing $225,000, and soil carbon that a little bit more, over $100,000, based on those yields. The 15 and the 4 are of course given to you by Vulcan. So that they're fairly certain. The 2 used for the soil carbon, we'll talk about that at the end, what you should do and how you should try to calculate it. I touched on that briefly yesterday using Luxi. I'll show you a bit more at the end. Now, if you do the calculation yourself, you'll see that it doesn't correspond to 100 hectare times 15 yields multiplied by $30. Don't forget, and never forget, the interesting 25% discount that is imposed by the CER. So you get you have your 15 yield, but in fact you're actually getting in ACCUs 75% of that, right? So that makes a big difference in cost. Now, what's interesting is, and quiz time, who can tell me based on that table, roughly, very roughly, what method is actually the best return on your investment? Dun, 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 dun. Any guesses? Rowan, come on, you can do NPVs in your head.
I don't really have enough information there, mate, but like avoid clearings is looking pretty attractive because you've got lower upfronts to some degree, but faster return on your cash flow.
Bingo. Well done. Yes, it is. If you're only talking return, yeah, Ron's got a computer in his head as far as money is concerned. Avoided clearing might not have such a high dollar return, but in terms of return on your investment, you're not actually spending a lot of money when you're doing an avoided clearing project, right? And as Ron said, you get your money up front. So whether you have to wait to get it for planting. So very often, as always, the devil is in the detail and it may change, but very often avoided clearing is quite competitive in terms of pure return. But if you have the cash to afford plantings, of course, you'll make a good return as well on with plantings, and you'll get more money at the end of the day. All right. Okie dokie. Any question on that page?
Just a quick qualifier on the soil carbon, 100,000 of I assume sampling costs every up to 5 years, and the return on soil carbon is return every 5 years. So where you've got avoided clearing, taking into account 3 audits over 25 years equaling 75 grand, the cash flow of the soil carbon is like 5 times that over the course of a 25-year project, both in terms of costs and in terms of income. Is that correct?
Say again.
So if I'm looking at the bottom on project ongoing costs and it's soil organic carbon, that over the 5 years, each 5 years you'd have $100,000 worth of sampling costs and 112,000 of payment, or are you thinking it's only $20,000 worth of soil sampling costs and you're doing that every 5 years over 25 years?
The latter.
The latter. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
No, that's over those two amounts are over the 5 years, over the 25 years of the project. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions from the floor? We did have one from Jeremy about audit costs under 200 hectares using the pilot method for EMP are non-existent. And there was a question from Liz, what triggers an audit and how often are they needed?
Good point. Very good point, both. Thanks, Jeremy. You're absolutely right to mention, which is why I absolutely love the pilot method, is that finally the CR has clicked on the fact that those audit costs are absolutely highway robbery. Don't get me started on auditors. Although some of them are quite nice, actually. Ryan, Tim, for example, is quite good and very nice. Still very expensive, but at least he's pleasant, which is not the case of all of them.
In fact, like for our first meeting, there was 4 of them. It was like, all right.
That's why they're expensive.
Well resourced, yeah.
Yeah, there was 4 of them, you know, the partner, down to the guy who actually, guy or girl who's actually doing the work. Sorry, I hope there's no auditor in the audience. Righto. So thank Jeremy, that really good point. The EMP pilot method does not require any audits, as long as you maintain the eligibility requirement all the way through the project. The minute you breach one of the eligibility requirements, you flip back to the good audit. Liz, to answer your question, it's actually on there's a little asterisk at the bottom. The number of dates of your audits will be in the audit schedule that's given at registration. At registration, you get three pieces of paper, official and rubber stamp and everything. One is a letter of declaration. Yeah, another one that gives you an exact map of the CEA and all the detail of your registration, the method, the starting date, the da-da-da-da. And the third one is what's called an audit schedule. An audit schedule specifies exactly the date and conditions of your audits. The number of audits is triggered by the size of your project, right? Below 50,000, so this is small, medium, and big, a bit like clothing. But there's 99% chance we are all going to deal with small projects, because the definition of a small project is a project that has less than 50,000 ACCUs per year. So yeah, we'll all be in the small. So small projects have 3 audits. Medium projects, which have from memory are between 50,000 and 150,000 ACCUs per year, have 5, and above that it's a gradual schedule depending on your exact number of ACCUs. So for a small project, you have 3 audits. One which is an initial audit, which is always at the first offset report. So your first offset report always have to be submitted with an audit, and after that you have the other 2. I've never seen anything different than, but the CR can do whatever they want in terms of dates of audit, but I've never seen anything other than the first offset report submitted after the date, which is roughly at the first third of the project, and the first offset report submitted after the date, which is at the second third of the project. So you have one project at the beginning, one at 30% of your project, and one at 60% of your project. But it's always triggered by an offset report. So it's not a fixed date, it's the first offset report after a fixed date, right? And so some of them are far away in the future, but they're highly predictable, which is a good thing. Does that answer your question, Liz?
Yes, thank you.
No worries. Rado. All right. So about my estimate, we've more or less covered some of that in the previous days, so I'll go quickly over it. There's two things when you calculate your abatement. You need to have an estimate at the beginning for the purpose of understanding the economics of your project, but also there's a field in every single form. You need to submit the forward abatement estimate, FAE, of your project. The only purpose, you don't have to be very precise, the only purpose of that FAE is precisely to calculate your audit schedule. So as long as you're as long as you're under 50,000, you're fine. But estimates and actuals in offset reports might be slightly different. The SOC, your estimates, we'll talk about that at the end, but it's basically you can use look-sees, experts, comparative sampling, test sampling to understand where your soil is at, and crystal ball, tea leaves, whatever is your best divination method to guess what your improvement potential is. I'm actually joking. There are some people that are actually pretty good at predicting that. Some of them, like downforce, can actually do that without sampling, based entirely on comparative properties and remote sensing. So I'd be happy to have, if anyone has an experience with downforce. I've only used them on one project, and they were okay, but not totally accurate when we finally did the actual sampling. So I'm a bit, but certainly promising. But I'd love to have more data points on downforce, if anyone has. For the full cam based, the estimates and the offset reports are actually the same because it's based on the calculation that you did at the beginning. Be aware though that the requirements, there's a requirement in every method to rerun full cam at every offset report. So that might change the calculation if for some reason the full cam database changes. Remember also when you're doing the abatement for a full cam based method to insert all the events that have actually happened, and also remember that full cam gives you only carbon stock, not abatements. After that, you have to do a lot of calculations from the carbon stocks to the abatement, which are usually carbon stock times 44 divided by 12, which is the famous 3.67, minus the emissions attributable to your project times the permanence discount. Never forget the 25 permanence discount. Keep the project data and make sure that part of the monitoring setup of the project, make a diary, create a procedure that, create a procedure that will keep the required data, right? For solid carbon, especially, you need to record the energy usage, the fuel usage, the irrigation that you're applying to your CEA, the fertilizer tonnage, type of fertilizer, the livestock emissions, whether you're doing tillage or soil disturbance, because all that are included into the project emissions. So keep a very serious record of that. For soil carbon as well, both the irrigation and the livestock baseline data, i.e. 5 years prior to it, will be important as well. There are provisions in the method for when you don't have that baseline data, but of course it penalizes you quite heavily. For example, the livestock baseline data, if you don't have the actual data, is based on the assumed carrying capacity of the land, right? Which is calculating using things like forage, for example, which massively underestimates your carrying capacity. You actually, let me state it another way. A lot of people actually stock far more than that assumed carrying capacity. And when you do an offset report, the emissions between your actual livestock, your actual stocking rate, and that assumed carrying capacity, the difference over your assumed carrying capacity will be counted negatively. And at one point, 5 tons of carbon per cow per year, that goes very, very quickly. So make sure that you have some baseline data and solid one for your baseline, because livestock emission can be a killer for the sub-project, right? Offset reporting, the reporting period dates are important because you need to run full cam, for example, full cam modeling in a given window around your offset reporting. Prepare the offset report as per the method, which can be quite complex and involved and costly if you're not doing it yourself. Do an audit if your audit schedule requires it. Submit the offset report with the audit. Receive the questions from the CER, and 6 months later, yes, be credited with the ACCUs. I can guarantee you that your first project, the day you receive the ACCUs, one of them or 2 of them will go towards a very good bottle of champagne, because it'll be a long road by the time you get there, but it's worth it. I'll still remember my first ACCUs. It's a bit like your first kiss or anything like that. Yeah. Maybe not that good. Get a life, Christophe. Get a life. Example of abatement calculation for the methods. Same template, basically. It's your current stock minus the baseline stock for soil carbon times the 3.67 minus all the emissions associated from fuel, fertilizer, livestock, tillage. The method has not approximative, but standard ways of calculating the emissions associated with all that. Typically, livestock, they use the number of heads per class multiplied by the average emission per head for your region that is in the National Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventory. So it's not your own emissions, it's that average. Same thing as tillage, depending on the depth of the tillage and your type of soil, etc. They calculate the, well, you have to calculate the emissions associated with that. So that can be quite a bit depending on what you're doing, including all residue for cropping, for example, and the proportion that you burn versus unburned residue left to decompose on the CEA, right? EMP, a lot easier. It's your current carbon stock calculated by full cam. After you've included all the events like thinning, fire, etc., minus the emission from fuel or associated with the project, only fuel, emissions from fire, and minus all emissions also. Avoided clearing, same thing, carbon stock calculated by full cam minus emissions from fuel and fire. So again, make sure that the landowner or the proponent knows ahead of time what record to keep, especially for soil carbon, but also the other methods. For example, if you use a vehicle to go around the CEA and have a look at it, whilst you're checking your fences, is that a project emission or farm use? Right? If you're in logbook you record that inspection to prove that you're discharging your monitoring obligations and keeping an eye on the disturbance in the CEA, then an auditor should normally ask you for the fuel use corresponding to that monitoring round. So be very clear in your report, in your monitoring, whether you say, I've gone to check the fence line and at the same time check on the CEA, or whether I went specifically to check the CEA, in which case you should record the fuel use, unless you walk the fence, of course. Right? Cool. Questions? No, nothing?
There was a quick question.
Yeah.
So question from Paris about accounting for the carbon emissions within the CEA. Her question, I think, was largely, is the AIA environmental accounting platform that uses the GAF method, is that going to be used to provide the greenhouse gas emissions for projects?
It's similar because it uses the same coefficients and etc. It's exactly the same coefficient that I use in the GAF calculators. But they require you to do the calculation manually, i.e. you can't say, I've put all my data in GAF, boom, here you go, that's the result. You need to show, I should have taken an example of the calculations for, fertilizer, for example, or livestock. They require you to do, and to list in your offset report, I had 58 cows, 37 cows, for 57 days, multiply the cows by an NGIS inventory, National Inventory of Greenhouse Gases coefficient, and that's my emission. So short answer, it's the same calculation as GAF, but you have to itemize it and list them separately.
Okay, thank you very much.
Christophe, if you're able to demonstrate that the inputs going into the GAF calculator, to the AIA calculator, if you're providing those inputs and then you're saying this is the result from the calculator, is that is that what you're saying? That it's you've got the calculator and that's the algorithm, and these are the inputs, and you need to be very specific about what those inputs are, as in 3 heifers for 250 days a year. As long as you've got those inputs and they're accurate, then presumably you could use the AI calculator because that's just coming up with a number based on those inputs. Have I understood that?
You absolutely could, but you still have in your written report, you literally have to write equation 60, 58 heifers multiplied by that equals this. Literally, you have to do that. So I honestly don't know whether the CR would I would say, certify the use of a given calculator that would allow you to do that. They might. I don't know. I don't know if it's ever been tried.
That does sound like something we want to talk to them about, doesn't it?
Yeah, yes. And look, it's hard to know because they're very, and rightfully so, compartmentalized between proponents. So I'm dead sure that a big proponent like Carbon Link or AgriProof have gone through the steps of having their little calculator recognized and version controlled and etc. Because the CR is pretty precise, but not as a single proponent. You'd have to go through all those steps, which probably would take a lot of time to do. I should show you an example of offset before. It's actually quite detailed. Woody, thank you. Project cost, or the expense database. I call it the expense database because RFM is actually collecting through various projects that we're involved in all those costs to be able to have a more precise database based on different locations, etc., of all the costs actually associated with a project. Just a few of the calculation of the categories here. Remember cash versus time costs. Talk to you about that. Monitoring costs, we've mentioned. Reporting costs, we've mentioned all of those. Sampling, solar tree, we've mentioned something for trees. The cost of calculation and submitting an offset report, actually don't underestimate it, given the complexity of some of those offset reports, especially for SOC, but even for EMP, it's not that simple, so don't underestimate that. Your project cost, fire break, pest control, permanence, plant obligation, fences, I've mentioned all of that before. So all categories of cost and project costs that you have. I think I've mentioned before as well, whether you include in your project accounting in a soil carbon project, the costs that go to your soil improvement, like planting legumes, is that part of the project cost base, or is it part of your farm operation? Because the benefit that you're reaping from those are carbon, but also carbon credits, but also production improvement. So how do you separate the accounting of the soil carbon project from the production accounting of the pasture or field that you're improving? Hard to do. I tend to never include those costs into the cost base of the project and keep that as part of the farm cost. But it's worth specifying that to the landholder when you're telling them that your project is going to bring them back that amount of money, but you have excluded something that could be costly, like planting legumes over the paddock. Righto. So we mentioned in the beginning that time matters in terms of cash flow. What you've got here is not the cash flow, but the ACCU flow of three methods. They're actually real projects from a property. The only thing that I've changed is the size. Those projects in the actual property have not exactly the same area, but I brought them all to the same area to make them comparable. But apart from that, the ACCU flows is the same. So that at the top, you've got on the same graph the EMP, which is the big one, the light blue one, and the soil carbon, which is the dark blue one. You see immediately that there's fewer soil carbon credit, and they're more limited in time than the EMP, right? The EMP method. But by the same token, the EMP method, you can see that a lot of your ACCUs are going to come, fairly in a far distant future. You got some of the ACCUs that are coming after 15 years, 16 years, up to 25 years. So those ACCUs do they have the same value for you as the ACCU that you're going to get immediately? And the extreme of that is the avoided clearing method, which is a graph at the bottom, where you have most of your ACCUs, say half of them up front. The actual proportion of the ACCUs that you have up front is actually depending on the age of your forest at the time of declaration. So it may vary a little bit, but typically you have a big spike of ACCU up front because basically you are accredited for all the ACCUs stored in your trees at the time of that the project starts. So you're taking the benefit of the past 20 years, right? And whether you have the benefits of the next 25 years, which are roughly equivalent, except that the trees grow more slowly in the last 25 years. So the last 25 years are not equal to the first 20 years if your project is declared at the age of the forest of 20 years. So I haven't put them on the same graph because you see that, you know, you got the 13,000 ACCUs bang in year one for an avoided clearing project, which, you know, the same graph actually completely dwarfs the other ones. But that's a very, very different ACCU flow profile than between the three methods, right? Now, if you look now,
why doesn't soil carbon continue to go up for 25 years, Christophe? Is it just because that project has only been in the ground for 10 or 12 years, but it assumes 6 years, 7 years of peak performance and then a decreasing return, as opposed to something that's cumulative and additional every year?
Oh, sorry. That's not a cumulative graph. That's an incremental graph. So your soil carbon doesn't actually decrease, but it stops growing. And that graph is you see what I mean? So, you know, your soil carbon increases, and then it doesn't decrease, but it increases more slowly. It's the incremental ACCUs per year. It's not the cumulative ACCUs per year. What it's
why
saying
doesn't
is
it
that
keep going past year 13?
that's a really, really good question. And I think there was some comment in the chat yesterday about that, about changing. I think it's Marcos who asked, what about changing method? Sorry, changing eligible activity. You should. I haven't assumed that is going to be the case. That graph is from Eckert, Richard Eckert, where he's got a graph showing for most properties how soil carbon increases and flattens over time. His point is to prove that you can't grow soil carbon forever. Once you've got the natural saturation point of your soil, then it'll stop. And actually, it's hard work to keep it there at the top. In actual fact, he says that most people usually stop their activities and you'd have negative bars, i.e. your soil carbon would come back, would start decreasing, right? Which would not penalize you under the SOC method. That's why it raised that. So that's Richard Eckert's estimates. Now, you're right. If you haven't reached your full potential in your soil with your current activity, you should switch activity, and maybe you'll get a second peak, etc. But no matter what, you're going to end up maximizing your soil at its potential. Right? I think there's the literature says there's 3 limits. You've got your theoretical potential in your soil. You know, where if a sandy soil, for example, doesn't have the same soil carbon holding potential as a clay soil, right? So you've got that potential. And then you've got your contextual potential, which is you might have the best soil in the world, but if you don't have the rainfall, well, you're never going to get to that full potential, right? And then you've got your actual soil carbon. So that's why. But good question, whether you can actually push that curve a little bit more. Righto. Now, if we translate that, which is just the ACCU side, and look at the actual cash flow of the project, i.e. taking into account the expense, this is what it looks like. And of course, as you'd expect, it looks enormously different. The red line is planting, the dark blue line is avoided clearing, and the light blue line is soil carbon. All right. You can see that soil carbon, for example, starts slightly negative cash flow because you have the initial initial soil sampling, where the planting is not massively cash negative because you have to fund the planting as well, right? And avoided clearing starts massively positive because you have that big kick of your first ACCU that you can claim, and after that plateaus because you don't have a lot of expenses, but you don't have a lot of ACCUs to claim either, right? So what you can see is that those projects have massively different profiles in cash. One, you get all your cash up front and you're sitting laughing, but you've got nothing after that. And the other one, you're going to invest quite a bit of money, but then you've got a slow and steady return over the years. That little kick at the end is just specifically for that project. The landholder wanted me to include the sale of the timber that was held in the forest. So at the end of the project, poof, that's where you sell the timber. Of course, you're not meant to, but that's what they wanted to do. So there you go.
And those expenses look inflated. Previously, when we looked at the 100 hectares, the expenses for environmental mallee plantings were at 300,000. That looks like it's minus $700,000 worth of plantings.
Yes, remember that's the actual projects. Maybe I should have made it comparable. Oh yeah, just took real project. That's over 284 hectares. You're right.
Okay, sorry.
Completely right. Yes. No. That's a good question. And also on those ones, you'll see that the flow of ACCU for environmental planting is quite smooth, which means that you claim often. That's what the landholder wanted to do. They wanted to claim quite regularly. I think they claimed every 2 years or something, quite often. And you can see the little dips here in audits. That's an audit year. That's obviously that'd be an audit, the second audit year. Voilà. So the important point is very, very different cash flow, and whether when you calculate the value of your project, whether you value the money that you're going to get in 20 years, the same as you value the money that you're going to get in year one, is a good question. And how to help you smooth this cash flow. RFM, for example, when we're offering proponents the ability to, landholders the ability to be the proponent for them and to smooth the cash flow, so that they don't have to incur those variations in cash flow, the equivalent. So maybe Ron, you should talk to that. You're more familiar with that.
I'll have it bring up an example of an avoided clearing as a financial model, and we can talk through that briefly.
Okay, sure.
Like, grab your screen.
I'll stop sharing. You can go.
There we go. So here you can see Christophe's up front and the cash flows. This is cash flows paid to a landholder for a avoided clearing project. And the way so this is a financial model for a project that we're doing up in the trap rock, but this is our kind of template, if you like, that we use for analysing projects and for helping farmers to understand the opportunity on their land, and then whether we help them kind of undertake the project for them. So there's a project input page which is specific to the project. That's where we input we grab the full cam numbers, so that the carbon abatement or the tons of carbon equivalent being sequestered at the various years according to full cam, and then you've got these assumptions with respect to costs for the particular project. And so these are real costs, and these are roughly equivalent to what Christophe was just taking us through earlier. We've got general inputs page where we can kind of model assumptions with respect to inflation and different price scenarios. And then you've got the financial model. So it's pretty simple, kind of. At the end of the day, what we're looking to do is to kind of understand what's the cash flow in, the revenue, and then how the costs kind of change over time. So that's, in a sense, all we're doing. We're grabbing the ACCU flow, and you can see, as Christophe said, 33% of the ACCUs you get them in year one, and we then take out the government buffer, and we work out, well, okay, if you were to sell those at the prevailing, assumed carbon price, this is the project revenue that would be generated, less the 5% fee that the mutual charges for managing the project, which is taken out of the revenue stream. And in a sense, the way we think about that is one of the advantages of going through the mutual is that we hope to be able to get a higher price for ACCUs than you will as an individual, basically, because we can actually engage with institutional buyers, and because we can actually tell a landscape story. So these ACCUs that we're looking at here are part of the trap rock, and so we're actually can talk about a story with respect to a whole project up there that's about connectivity, community kind of engagement, and what have you. So the idea is that the costs of using the mutual are funded through the higher revenue that you're actually receiving. And so then you can see the costs coming through on this goes out the 25 years, and you've got your upfront costs. So as Christophe was saying, your eligibility, feasibility, mapping, these are all the costs of being, Christophe engaging with the clean energy regulator for weeks on end, as he shoehorns the project through the clean energy regulator. Then ongoing costs. So those project assumptions we had back on the project inputs page, we escalate them at the inflation rate. So we've kind of got a real sense of what the real income is over time and the real expense base is over time. And you can see that those costs are for the avoided clearing audits. We're assuming that the first audit's 19,000 and thereafter it's 15,000 for the next two. Again, we're hoping, and hence the reason why we're talking to auditors currently, we're hoping that because the mutual can offer scale, we can kind of negotiate a better price. We can have them kind of come and do whole regions at the same time. So because that is the biggest cost. It is one of the biggest costs with these on an ongoing basis with these projects. So you've got your MVR costs, you've got your profit. That's just the ACCU sales less the costs gives you your project profit, and that's the raw profit. And so that's this idea of that's what you if you were to undertake this project based on those ACCU price assumptions. I didn't show you those on the front page. We've got you can see them there. We're assuming that the ACCU price goes up over time. But based on those ACCU assumptions you generate and your full CAN model, you've got these revenue assumptions, you've got these cost assumptions, which are based on known costs today that are escalated at CPI. And then that generates your profit. And then importantly, that concept that Christophe was talking about the time value of money, the way that kind of the market comes at that is to kind of understand the present value of it brings all future cash flows to today's terms, basically. So the present value of $33,000 in 2027 is currently 31,000, assuming an inflation rate of 3%. The present value of $31,000 in today's term is 26,000 if we receive that 31,000 in 2031. So that's the difference between the face value of those, the project profit of 375,000. That's the face value. That's a nominal value each year you'd get. But if you were to present value all those cash flows back to today's dollars, that's worth $300,000 today. So that's the effect of kind of inflation over time, if you like. And so then as Christophe was talking to, we look to smooth the cash flows. So we look at how we can manage those cash flows to deliver a payment stream to the landholder that's got the equivalent present value, but is and they're getting, in this case, most of the cash flow up front, paying for their upfront costs. So if you can see here, the revenue was 125,000, which was the same as up above. So the revenue is 125,000. You've got your costs being the sales and admin, and the project costs generating a net amount of 86,000 that's paid today, which would be roughly equivalent to what they'd be getting if someone was doing it themselves. But then we're looking to smooth the cash flows over time by effectively smoothing these the ACCUs coming in and selling them on a kind of progressive basis over time. And so that enables us to, by the end of the project, to end up with a small positive balance, which pays for this. We've got a shortfall that year, so that pays for the interest costs for that, and therefore allows for that cash flow where and farmers can choose between getting, in this case, this particular landholder can choose between getting $10,000 that year based on the assumption that the carbon price was, I think, $45 that year, or they can choose to take the ACCU equivalent, being 226 ACCUs, or some blend thereof. So if a farmer is looking to be net zero, for example, and their farm emissions are 100 tonnes per year, they might like to take 126 100 ACCUs in terms to offset their emissions, and RFM can then issue a certificate saying you're net zero and retire those carbon credits for the farmer and receive the balance in cash. So that's kind of the way that works, I guess. Very easy.
Questions from the floor before we move back to Christophe about financial models, and maybe there's questions about proponents, whether it's better to be a self-proponent or to have somebody like RFM be a proponent on your behalf if you can get a higher price or smooth out cash flow, or if any of those things are of interest. And fascinating chat going on between Gavin and Mike. I can hear the tones of your voices in your clicking of keys. It's fantastic. Nobody's. All right. Well, we must have done something wrong, guys, because we've taken the most exciting day of this 5-day course, the economics of ACCUs, and we've got no questions tonight. So
I've got a question.
Go, Jack.
Yeah.
Always. Is there anything in your magical mystery tour, Christophe? Is there any sneaky cost that you would highlight? Is there anything that was a surprise that you sort of found in the legislation or found buried? Is there anything that we can benefit from your experience?
No, they're all in there. They're pretty. Two things to note. Something which is not always well understood is that the cost of registration is zero, nothing. There's absolutely, from the CR perspective, I mean, you don't have to pay anything to register a project. That's a good thing. But to answer your question, no, there's no real hidden costs. The only thing that probably you need to be wary of is what I was listing at the beginning, is those preparation costs, etc., can add up a little bit. And ongoing, for example, an offset report preparation might cost you a few $1,000s. So on small project, you've got to be careful about that. Having said that, if you think about it from an investment perspective, investing, would it be $10,000 to register a project that's going to bring you $800,000? is a pretty good investment. But I've always found that the landholders are a little bit shy to invest the money up front because they don't really understand the actual return, or because it's unfamiliar. There's sort of not there's a bit of reticence to believe in the future return, but the cash that they have to pay up front is real, and therefore it's a little bit overinflated. The upfront costs are a little bit inflated, but let's not say that they don't exist either. I mean, we're talking real money when you're talking about $10,000 to register a project or $2,000 to prepare an offset report is the real costs. The other costs as well that you got to be careful not to underestimate are agroecologist or agronomist costs for planting. It is a very specialized field. It needs a lot of attention, and that might be costly as well. So when you are planning your project, make sure that you got an ecologist or an agronomist that is clear about all the costs that will be included in the planting, including looking after the planting and replacing them if you can, etc., etc. So they're probably the most risky areas in terms of cost.
And Rowan, a question for you in the chat.
I was actually enjoying when you were talking, Rowan, because I could read the chat. It's fascinating, the debate going in there.
I was just reading it myself. The assumptions around price in the future, you can make your own assumptions. Basically, we have current buyers for the ACCUs that we're likely, that will be coming through this AC project, which are likely to be approaching, Woody, like it's much higher where they are from where the current spot price is currently, basically. So I don't know. It depends on who you talk to, but like if you look at the market analysis undertaken by folks like PwC, Deloitte, and Reputex, the general assumption is there's enough, or I think the general finding is that there looks to be enough ACCUs from existing projects to meet demand over the next kind of 3, maybe 5 years, so running into 2030, and that's because the projects are delivering into that are the ones that were undertaken or commenced some years ago. The thought is there's a transition from the current system where the ERF's been the big buyer to the safeguard buyers that really kicks in after 2030. And so the expectation is that it's the safeguard mechanism buyers that will be driving demand and are currently driving demand, but they're driving demand that part of the curve. So that's why we have assumptions that prices will get higher, and the work that the work I've seen from both Reputex and PwC talks to the need for prices to approach in north of 50 in order to be able to kind of encourage the supply to come on market. And they're making assumptions about soil carbon. So like they're making some fairly bullish assumptions about the carbon that'll be generated from the agricultural sector in particular. And that's still underpinning those assumptions that the carbon price will be higher than 50 going forward.
Yeah, Sarah, we've taken a $40 price on that carbon project that we were looking at, and we've been offered for the first 1,000 ACCUs, not the whole volume, $100. I've seen an environmental mallee plantings project sell this last week at $49 an ACCU compared to a spot price of $33. And you regularly see Indigenous savanna charging, changing hands at $55 to $57 an ACCU compared to the spot price of $33. And we argue that Indigenous savanna is a narrative difference, not, it's still a ton of carbon dioxide. And so helping our farm groups in their landscape, really articulate their narrative, we think will keep the prices at the high end of the spot market.
And thank you. I guess I just wanted to ask that question so that this sort of conversation was captured, if that makes sense. Yeah, to aid in that understanding. Yeah.
Yes, Sarah?
Okay.
Wardy, can I jump in there and ask a question? Is that okay, please?
Please, Wendy.
So this isn't something that, well, you heard me ask this question before, and it's something that, so for anybody listening, for our Murray Inland Delta, we're looking at doing some sort of an aggregated project, hopefully, potentially, a model of one. And it would involve, it wouldn't be soil carbon, it would be an EMP project. So we keep coming back in our discussions, our discussions in our farmer groups, to this idea that we need a floor price. We need a trigger price. We need some sort of mechanism in this that above a certain price, whether it's $50 or $60 or $75, above a certain price, yes, bang, we're ready to go. But below that, it's just not workable or doable, and it's a no-go. Is there consideration, Rowan, to some sort of floor price being worked into these models of aggregated projects?
Sorry, so the concept of a floor price, I mean, so when you talk about the wool industry, for example, there was I guess, is that where that potentially is coming from? But so the way a market mechanism might work to encourage that, but basically what you're saying is the price needs to be above a certain level in order to make these projects economic in our area, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And we're interested at be above a certain price, but below that, it's not worth our while.
Yeah, well, just knowing that and giving visibility to that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if there's other areas of the country that can meet demand at a lower price and are happy to sell into it, well, at the end of the day, that's where the market price will be. But I think that the point is that the expectation is that prices will need to be above 50 in order to kind of bring supply onto the market. And what you're effectively saying is, well, it's uneconomic for us to participate below this price anyway.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm interested, Wendy, because I would have said that for an EMP project, the floor price would be way below 50. Most EMP projects are profitable, and quite so. It depends on your yield, of course, and a number of other factors. But I would have guessed that the floor price for EMP would be probably below 30.
No, we're also operating, Christophe, on smaller areas. So we did a lot of work on how to make 20, 30, 40 work. Because we have a very diverse, and Wendy knows this really well too, but we have really diverse and complex businesses with irrigation systems and, inside a delta, and, there's lots of different land management units and different enterprises on different, summer and winter cropping elements and things like that. So we really worked on how could 20 work. And it doesn't work at 30, that's for sure.
No,
only just works at 50. But again, this is the narrative, and this is where we see aggregation for buying and selling power so crucial for us, and telling our story in an inland delta.
Yeah, so it's right back
definitely.
To need to be able to tell the story. So and if you can provide visibility to the market that this is where our supply is at, and we can provide that to the market, and then the market understands that it's not just about carbon, it's about biodiversity, it's about rehydration. So there are these stacked benefits. That's what people will be buying into. So
but if you have a, and that's actually in the next few slides, if you have a floor price that is so high, it implies that you have either that you have a very low yield or you have very high costs. And that's where the aggregation is essential to reduce your costs, because if you're stacking 5 20 hectare projects and adding the fixed cost of that, you're definitely killing your project. But if you aggregate that and it is identical to a 100 hectare project, then it should be, your floor price should be a lot lower. So interesting. Aggregation will be your, sorry.
Yep, and it's about looking for us with our diverse and complex farming models. It's about looking at opportunity costs as well.
Oh, yes. By the way, which is, if I can present briefly, and we've got 2 minutes to finish, because that point, hi, Wendy, by the way, I didn't click when you asked the question the other day, who you were, but now I do make the connection.
She was Peter the other day.
I was Peter the other day.
That's probably why. Here you go. So just very briefly, because we've got about 2 minutes left, what you mentioned, Wendy, is very true, is that when you compare on those graphs soil carbon with the other one, it's actually very unfair, because there's a huge difference between the soil carbon project and an ACCU or an EMP project. Is that a soil carbon project is on productive land, where both of the other ones are either on reduced productivity land or taking productive land out of productivity or towards reduced productivity. So it is very unfair to compare the return of a soil carbon project to the other ones, because the other ones are not productive, whether the soil carbon one actually supporting production. So to have an equal view of the returns, you would need to take into account the productivity of the soil for your normal production, right? So the other things I wanted to discuss, well, I think we should leave it for tomorrow, because it'll take a while. It's an interesting discussion to have, and I saw in the chat that Mike had very interesting points to say on that, is to compare the returns, the detailed returns of a 100 hectare carbon project with 1,000 hectare carbon project, and how the economics compare, and where is the tipping point, which is the equivalent of the floor price, but for a different parameter, in terms of soil improvement. What do you have to believe in your soil improvement capability to make sure that a 100 hectare project is viable compared to 1,000, right? So, and the hypotheses are very different. But I'd like to go through that in detail, if we can do that probably tomorrow, because it'll probably take more than half a minute to actually go through that. So let's leave that for tomorrow. And this is it for today.
And do you just want to preview what we're going to cover tomorrow in terms of FAQs and how to deal with farmers and all? Well, what are your plans for tomorrow's content?
Yeah, tomorrow we'll talk briefly about the FAQs from the farmers, because you have the typical questions that are, what happens in case of, if I want to sell my property, how RQs are taxed, does the value of my property stay the same or increase, etc. So this standard question that landholders have, and very, very good question usually, and how to deal with them. And that's basically just it. I wanted to talk about the, we said that we wanted to talk about the RFM Code of Conduct as well, very briefly. What I intended to keep most of the time for tomorrow to understand the experience of whomever among you have actually done the case study and, created a login on the CER system, and see what you found, and, if you have any questions or where you got stuck, and etc. I hope at least a few have tried, and see what the experience has been. So I suspect we'll talk briefly about the soil carbon page, comparing those 2,000 hectare and 100 hectare project. then quick review of the most common question asked by landholders on legal and tax and accounting, and then talk about the case study.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christophe. Thank you, everybody. Look forward to catching up with you. What a way to spend a Friday night between 8:15 and 9:00. You're allowed to bring beers along, or wines or whatever you want. We'll see you tomorrow evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.